All right, well, thanks for joining us. I'm Robert Pavlovich here on behalf of the Burgundy Lovers Facebook group. As you know, this was started by Kyun Chia in 2018. And today we're fortunate to be here talking Burgundy with William Kelley, who writes and reviews Burgundy and Champagne for the Wine Advocate, and who's also recently started making his own wine. Some of you might know. So, William, thanks for being here. I think I speak for most of us in saying that we really appreciate you as kind of a voice for Burgundy and how you're an enthusiast first, above all else. How did you get your start into wine and Burgundy in particular?
Oh, thanks very much for having me. I entered wine writing really as a wine lover first and foremost, and right about the time I went to Oxford in 2008 to read history, I started becoming very interested in wine, started visiting wine regions, reading about wine, and joined a tasting group that I ended up running during my years as a doctoral and master's student. We would have really serious producers coming once a week during the academic term to present their wines. So when we did Domaine Dujac back to 1978, Villa La Roche with Jeremy Sace, we did Salon, all sorts of things. I mean, great tastings. Also, a lot of producers from California, from the Rhone. Small producers, big producers, and not just sort of focused on classic regions. And I was spending more and more of my time visiting wine regions especially in Burgundy. Increasingly, I think the maxim that all roads lead to Burgundy is pretty apposite. And in the end, starting out in 2008, you could visit pretty much anyone you wanted to. Maybe you couldn't get an appointment at Cache or Loire or DRC. But even as a student, I managed to visit DRC. And by sort of 2012, 2013, when I was really in the middle of my doctorate, not only, I think a lot of people doing doctoral study in humanities would relate to the notion that academia is the one form of institutionalized punishment where you get extra time for good behavior. It can be a very sort of solitary experience. And I was devoting more and more time to visiting wine regions on the one hand, and on the other, finding it harder and harder to get appointments. As I think everyone who visits Burgundy regularly has probably sort of experienced that its access is increasingly difficult. So I ended up moving to California, working harvest, and at the same time studying writing about wine, covering Burgundy for Decanter magazine, as well as North American wines. And it was just a great opportunity to try the kinds of wines I was interested in buying before I bought them, to have now an excuse to spend 6 months a year in Burgundy and have a cellar there. And it's been a wonderful, wonderful excuse to just indulge an overpowering passion, really.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Well, so first on the docket, we had the most exciting developments in Burgundy today. I know you wanted to kind of focus on the viticulture here, so.
Yeah, no, I think if you take what's going on today in just the last couple of years in a deeper perspective, and I look back to phylloxera and the way Burgundian viticulture sort of last had a moment like this in the 1870s, 1880s, when the vineyards which used to be planted by Provenage en four, with just each new vine was a buried shoot of the mother vine, if you like. They were very, very high density, not in rows, whatever. This was the state of things before phylloxera. With the replanting of phylloxera, the grafting onto American rootstocks, that was sort of the excuse really to put into practice ideas that people have been evolving in the late 19th century. People like Dr. Guillaume, most famously, who were advocating for slightly lower planting densities and for trellising in rows. And that was just sort of adopted wholesale in the aftermath of phylloxera in Burgundy. And okay, so you had in the 80s and increasingly in the 90s and 2000s, you had people starting to think a bit more about their cultural practices in terms of organics and biodynamics. But the way the vineyards of Burgundy looked didn't change fundamentally. It was really the same kinds of trellising regimes. Some people maybe would have slightly higher canopies. People like Christophe Roumier started doing that in the mid-90s. But by and large, the landscape hasn't looked that different until suddenly now. And now you see people experimenting with much higher trellising wires, and particularly given the vine is an apical dominant plant, trying to find ways to avoid cutting off that apical shoot. That apical shoot, when you cut it, sends a hormone response to the plant to produce more vegetation, effectively. So the more you cut it, the more you need to cut it, the more you need to trim it, and that in turn retards the sort of physiological transformations of the fruit. The plant stays in the vegetative phase instead of concentrating on ripening the fruit. And there are other disadvantages. I think we were discussing in the subject of Premox and white Burgundy. I think that's probably a good place to get into some of the other things that some of those cultural practices do that might be detrimental to fruit quality. But effectively now, whether it's this higher training wires and rolling the canopies, or if it's actually training the vines on their own individual stakes, on an echelon as it's called, which is what people were doing again before phylloxera back in the first 3/4 of the 19th century and before, you're allowing the plant to sort of have sort of full phenotypic expression, and you know, it's very interesting. And suddenly, when you see Trappé have just put all their Gevrey Combat over to Echelon, you know, Bizet has done that with all his vines in Vaune since 1999. La Lubis-Loire has been rolling her canopies, but now in the last couple of years does so much higher. Ugapi is doing it. Durocher is doing it. You know, but there are people doing it in Morange. There are people, I mean, even Jacques Prieur has started doing it. So suddenly, and this has just happened really in the last handful of years, the drive from Marcenais to Beaune and beyond looks very different looking out of the window. You know, the landscape is really changing, and I think this is going to be very exciting. I regard it as one of a number of adaptations which are going to be really helpful in this sort of warming climate. Because with training the vines like that, you get accelerated physiological maturations, and so you get full ripeness of the fruit with lower sugars. You don't have to wait so long with the fruit on the vine accumulating sugar. So this is very interesting. You also get higher levels of organic acid in the must, so you have freshness. And that, I think, along with, especially in Pinot Noir, attention to the kinds of nasal selections people are planting, and maybe also looking at cultivation practices of the soils, there would be sort of the three principal ways that people making red wine in Burgundy can respond to climate change. Now, Chardonnay, two of those things apply to, but there's much less genetic diversity in Chardonnay, so that, I think Chardonnay is going to be trickier. And again, it's a pity in the sense that the appellation system is so constraining in that regard, because if you look back to this kind of wines that were made again in the before phylloxera, as far as we can tell from the literature, it was a lot more planted that wasn't Chardonnay in the Côte de Beaune. And famously, Coton Charlemagne used to have Aligoté, used to have Pinot Blanc, Pinot Gris. Everybody I think knows about that. And some appellations today, like Savigny-le-Beaune, you're allowed to have a certain percentage of Pinot Blanc as it is. But if you really look at old vine plantings, I mean, there's a famous producer of Merceau, I won't say which because he's never spoken about it publicly, but who has a hectare of Pinot Blanc growing near the campsite of Merceau. And there are these other varieties out there, Pinot Arsois, and I think especially Pinot Blanc, of course, Aligoté, that have quite interesting potential if only they were permitted by the appellation system as a way to build freshness into Chardonnay wines in a sort of warming climate. But of course, there are other things you can do, but we'll get onto that with regards to premature oxidation. So yeah, that in sum is changes in trellising practices, vineyard management practices I find the most exciting, and particularly as regard to their potential for mitigating the impact on wine quality of a warmer climate.
So would you say, you know, out of all the producers you talk to, is it 50% who are changing what they're doing in the vineyards, or is it more?
Oh, fewer. I mean, there's an artificially high percentage of the people I visit and meet because they're people who
Right.
interest me. But the reality is that the change is very slow. Of course, you know, and your eyes are drawn to these sort of novelly trained vineyards. But if you walk around the hillside of Beaune, you know, it's still the majority of people are still using herbicide, I would estimate. So we're very far from, you know, that sort of level. And I think you're in fact going to see more and more of a bifurcation between sort of, you know, classic in a, you could say, a pejorative sense, viticulture, and the producers who practice it, and those willing to push things further and further in terms of the prices of the wines, the esteem in which they're held. And, you know, sometimes we get the same kind of biased perspective when I review a vintage. You know, I can review a vintage such as 18 and find plenty of good wines if I visit the good producers. But so to sort of ward off against this, I always try to go to an average French supermarket, purchase sort of 5 or 6 bottles of just, you know, very low appellation Burgundy from producers I've never heard of. They may be co-op labels or labels that would be done especially for the supermarket or whatever. I mean, just I make a point of not going for producers I know, just to get an idea of what what you might experience hearing that, say, imagine you heard that 2018 is a great vintage from the wine press, and what would be your experience then buying a wine simply on the strength of the vintage alone and with no other information? And the results can be quite disgusting. So there's a lot of very bad, it's really important to remember there's a lot of very bad wine being made everywhere, in fact. We have this, as a wine writer, and I'm visiting even 200, 300, 400 producers on the Côte d'Or alone, probably. I haven't lost count, really. But I still have a very partial view of what's going on as a totality in Burgundy.
Right. Well, shall we get into Primox?
Yeah.
Kind of yesterday, William and I were talking about, preparing for this, and it just kind of came up in the conversation. And I know it comes up, on the group boards, inspires a lot of passion and people you rarely hear from, I kind of mentioned, should we do the top 3 to 5? And you said, no, we got to do top 7.
Yeah. So, it depends how you count. They're either more or fewer, depending on how you break down the various.
Yeah, and it makes sense. It's a complex issue. There's a lot of misinformation or just misunderstandings people just kind of carry with them. So I think this will be good. Do you want to start out with a couple common misconceptions on this?
Well, I would say there are 2 really big misconceptions. One I would say is that we don't know. This is a misconception that we don't know what's causing it. In fact, we are well aware of a lot of things that cause premature oxidation in white wine. It's multifactorial, so it's for people looking for the answer to be this is X are going to be disappointed, and there are many different combinations of problematic factors that can multiply in a sort of awful concatenation to mean that a particular producer suffers with Primox. It can be different at different domains. So it's complex, but it's not, it wouldn't be accurate to say that we didn't have a very good idea of many of the key issues behind it. I think the other one is the sort of idea that it's just the closure. The closure is clearly important. We'll get onto that. And in some ways, a totally hermetic anaerobic seal can be a silver bullet for the problem. But the reason you get 6 bottles out of 12 oxidized is because variability in the closure is highlighting the fundamental fragility of the wine. And so the more oxygen permeable closures, the corks with the higher OTR rate, oxygen transmission rate, are going to be the bottles that oxidize first. But the underlying issue is that the wines are fragile, especially fragile to oxidation. So I think you can, even if you can just solve the issue by completely protecting the wine from oxygen with an anaerobic closure, that's not the same as getting back to a situation where we can have the same kinds of evolution with accumulating complexity over time. This is really what we're looking for with aged white Burgundy. We're not just looking for it to be frozen in time, because otherwise what would be the point of aging it at all?
Right.
But we've got ahead of ourselves with some of those things. Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the logical place to start is talking about viticulture. And this goes back to something I was saying, this sort of the classic system of viticulture in Burgundy, which was either cultivating the soils, either cultivating the soils or using herbicides, but certainly eliminating all kind of vegetative growth in the soils other than vines throughout the year. So this releases a lot of nitrogen into the vines, and it really stimulates vegetative growth and sap flow, and it reduces the acidity levels in the grapes, right? So that's one thing. And again, back in 1970, the acidity levels are really not an issue in Burgundy. Today, acidity levels on average, if you just look at the numbers, I mean, they're definitely, the total acidity of the wines is a good couple of grams lower in many cases. I was talking to Bernard Ravenel about it. And so you can imagine a situation where viticulture adapted to the climate of the 70s is no longer at all appropriate today. So there's that issue about how the soils are worked or not. And then I think the other is the regular hedging of the vines. So you think about it, if you hedge, not only does it, as I mentioned before, cut the apical shoot and encourage vegetative growth, it also effectively concentrates the vine's sap flow in the remaining volume of the vine. So this means more sap into the berries, and you get fatter grapes. So if you hedge really late in the season, especially in a hedge on a very regular basis, you're going to have fatter grapes. And you're also going to get more second crop. So really, this isn't very good for the balance of the vine. And when you combine those issues, so the issue of how the soils are worked, more nitrogen, more vegetative growth, more sap flow, lower acids, with hedging repeatedly, then you add to that clonal selections, which have fatted berries because people were really looking for more juice, and so the ratio of solids to juice has only deteriorated from the perspective of wine quality in the last 30 years. And now that's been even more flagrant in Champagne, because since the 1980s in Champagne, the average cluster weight there has doubled. And so you have imagined the berries are much bigger, and you're getting much more juice and much less of the sort of interesting flavones and antioxidants in the skins of the grapes that can protect the grapes. And while we talk about viticulture, those are the points I would make. I would say there's one kind of red herring with glutathione, which has been talked about a lot since Denis Derbadieu did his paper on it. Now, the argument that comes out of that is that glutathione is this great antioxidant which will magically protect wines from oxidation, and the more of it you have in the grapes, the better. And so grapes from vines which have higher access to nitrogen will produce more of it, so you want more nitrogen. Well, in fact, if you have excessive nitrogen levels in your vines in your grapes, you're going to lose all the acids. And the question about how much glutathione you have in your finished wine has a lot more to do with how you press, the sort of extraction you get from the skins, and the extent to which you retain gros lees, the bord, for the primary fermentation. So this is a complete red herring, and I think that research was, I'm speculating about motives here, which is always imprudent, but I think it has to do with your modern enology. Modern enological science likes to create problems and then come up with an additive to solve them, So you have extraction enzymes, and then you find you have this sort of horribly extracted wine, so they give you clarification enzymes. And this is similar. I mean, I think if anyone's on the call as a physician, I think we could probably think of equivalent examples in medical sciences where, you end up taking one medication to counteract the side effects of another. And it's a little bit like that. So I think that's a bit of a red herring, and just sort of concentrating on solid to juice ratio in your fruit and maintaining acidity levels in the vineyard is one of the key things that we could be doing to mitigate the sort of tendency of wines to be very fragile to oxidation.
Yes, and Kuhn had that question on current trends in pressing.
Yeah, well, and that's the next phase. So yeah. What has changed here? And the answer is presses that are very gentle, but at the same time, these pneumatic presses, I think probably everyone on the call has some idea of how they work. Long cylinder with a inflatable bag inside it. You load it with grapes and then the bag inflates. But every time you want to break the cake to get a more efficient, more rapid extraction of juice, what happens is the drum rotates, the bag de-inflates, and gravity causes the cap to break down. And this is the equivalent motion to, in an old-fashioned basket press, getting in there with a fork and breaking up the cake that you're pressing. It's called a rebêche, which is a word really to do with the forking process rather than the idea of a drum de-inflating, but the same principle. What happens when you do that is, in fact, every time you have a rebêche, because you're breaking up the cake, you're extracting more potassium out of the cake, or rather potassium is binding with acid. So you get a big jump in pH every time you do a rebêche. So at the same time as having this very clean juice from this gentle pressing, each time you break the cake, you're losing acidity. Whereas the old school way to do it in a basket press is you crush the grapes, you put them in, and this is very old school. I mean, this is pre-Vaslin what I'm talking about here. You crush the grapes, put them in, and then you squeeze them, and then you break the cake maybe once, at most 3 times. This is how champagne grapes are pressed, and it's about preserving acidity. And because it's time consuming, because that's not a very efficient way of extracting juice, it can take 4, 5, 6 hours to complete a press cycle. So during that time, you're getting a lot of extraction of flavones and interesting antioxidants from the skins. So it's a very interesting process. Today, a typical white wine press cycle 1 on a Buca press or Euro press or any of the brands, and I've used them all, lasts about 2 hours and 10 minutes and has about 20 rotations. So 20 times the cake is broken. Going up to, even if it's only going up to like 2 bars, so it's very gentle pressing, relatively little in the way of skin extraction because it's short and it's not firmly squeezing the skins. At the same time, high pH, and then also not enough of the solids that you need to sponsor a healthy barrel fermentation or to provide the sort of antioxidant structure during aging. So there are a lot of problems. If you look at what the Vaslin press did, I mean, that was just firmer and harder. So you're getting that sort of extract. And those were really being used in the era when acidity was not an overriding concern. So if you're breaking the cakes, they break the cake with chains internally, in fact, the Vaslin presses. And if you're doing that a few times, it's not really a big deal. And it's also more intuitive. You know, Vaslin has, it's not, you know, it's not computerized. There's no cycle one you press and then you just go away and have your lunch. You know, you have to be there kind of making it press. So I think pressing is clearly a big part of it. And it's exciting to see some people going back to using Vaslins. I think maybe more thoughtfully, some people using champagne presses. That's what Jean-Marie Guffins does in the Mâconnais.
Can I elaborate a little on the Vaslin, because it's a mechanical press?
Yeah.
And is it true that you extract more skin material by that mechanical pressing?
Oh, I believe so, because it's harder and it's more, you know, more aggressive.
Yes. So, and actually in the mid 90s when Premox, you know, came up, that was also the era, there's more practice, of course, also the era when, you know, a vast majority of winemakers switched to pneumatic presses, the boucher.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, I mean, this goes back to my point about there not being a single silver bullet to this. One of the first producers to adopt the pneumatic press, I think in 1982, was René Lafont. And René Lafant's 82s, 83s, 85s have no issues. It was only later when other things changed in the cellar that Lafont started having systematic oxidation issues. So this is one of the problems. But yes, I mean, I absolutely agree. I think, in fact, with the pneumatic press, it is possible to get a very good result. And if you look at someone like Benoit Ant, who's thought about this, he only does 2 rebêches during his whole 3-hour plus press cycle. So he presses longer. He also crushes the grapes a little bit first and does fewer rotations. So the technology itself is not really the problem. It's just how it's used. And the pneumatic press makes it easier to do the wrong thing and simpler and quicker to do the wrong thing from the wine quality perspective, I think. It's not inherently the technology that's at fault, it's how it's employed.
Yeah, Rémi Jobard actually has very few rebêches, and he presses for 12 hours.
Yeah, right, which I think is sensible.
He has very, very little Pinots.
Yeah, although I have had some oxidized wines from him, some 07s and some 08s, with him in his cellar. But this is the thing. I mean, who would we say are the only producers that where we've never had any Premox? I'd say Dauphiné, and I've never personally had a Premox bottle of Koch, although I know people who have had Premox 11s. But beyond that, I think everybody who's been touched by it. The question for me is, are they impacted more than they were statistically before 96? And I think almost always the answer is yes. I mean, I think back in the day, there were still some wines that ended up oxidizing for whatever reason.
And William also mentioned that Koch, Dauphiné, and Raveneau all buy corks from the same producer, right?
Yeah, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. I mean, let's talk. So we did viticulture. We talked about pressing. Then, I mean, coherently, we should talk next about élevage practices.
Sure.
I mean, hinted at one of the issues of pressing with the pneumatic press is excessively clean juice, so you don't have enough of the gross lees. I think that's clearly part of it. Another issue has to be batonnage, but done at the wrong time. And this is another aspect of Premox that I think is misunderstood, is that in the early when the wine is still producing CO2, whether from the primary or secondary fermentation, batonnage by suspending the lees, which are in themselves reductive, is not an oxidative technique. It's when the fermentation is finished, and by stirring it, you degas it of the CO2, which protects it to some extent against oxygen diffusion. That's when batonnage becomes an oxidative technique. So really, you don't want to be doing batonnage on wines that have finished their fermentation, especially when you see people doing batonnage on wines that have been racked, which is an incredible thing to be doing. If you think about the purpose of batonnage is to suspend lees, so why would you do it with a wine that has very little in the way of lees to suspend? So that's one issue. I think simply also that the extremely oxidative effect of using very high percentages of new oak also arguably a part of the problem. And I think, again, there's some producers where I think this is probably part of the cause. I think when some of the Verger wines from Guffins in the mid-90s that has those kinds of issues, it was oak related. I think probably some of Lafond's issues at a certain phase of his winemaking career were oak related. And if you remember, the mid-90s was when we saw a lot of new things coming along. We saw peroxide rinsing for closures, and we'll get into that later. I think that's another thing that's somewhat misunderstood from a technical perspective. We saw the rise of machine bottling, so higher percentages of new oak, clarification enzymes, which people started using. And I have microbiologist friends who tested commercial clarification enzymes, which people use to clarify the wine more rapidly so they can bottle it and sell it faster. Those sometimes contaminated with oxidase enzymes, which cause oxidation. So a lot of new technology, which was perhaps not necessarily broadcast particularly at the time, also the presses, that came along in the mid-90s, which again makes it very much harder. You know, normally with a problem like this, you'd see what did people do differently at this one moment when the issues began, and you'll be able to find an answer. But the problem is a lot of things were changing,
Right.
which only makes it more complicated. So yeah, so those are some issues with élevage. Then I think when it comes to bottling practices, we talked about this yesterday, you know, and I hinted at it just now, the rise of machine bottling, which involves pumping the wine through pipes, hoses to get to the bottling machine. Then often to make sure the temperature is correct, if it's coming out of a cold cellar in the winter, in the old machines, it was run through like a copper pipe that was just heated with a naked flame going to the metal pipe. I mean, the most rudimentary of technology. You can think about what sort of thing this does to the wine. Not only has it been disturbed by being pumped through the line, which is full to start with of air and attendant oxygen, then it's got up to temperature by methods that can be very brutal, and then it's pumped in often quite aggressively into the bottle with much splashing, and you can, as a result, I think you get lots of dissolved oxygen, especially at the beginning and end of a bottling line. With Burgundy, with these very small cuvées, and again, this coincides with the move towards micro parcel bottling, small 2-3 barrel cuvées. You run one of those through a bottling line, you should really be discarding the first 15 and last 15 cases as a conservative estimate. And when you only have a cuvée of 75 cases, it's really economically not feasible to do that. Chateau Lafite can do that. But you know, somebody making 3 barrels of Merceau Louchet is probably reluctant to. So the bottling practices, in turn, another issue of that is people started, in order to bottle by machine, to do a big homogeneous bottling run, you rack to tank. And people often, and there's still producers such as until a few years ago, Fontaine Gagnard, they rack to tank and then they bottle straight away. When you rack to tank, you pick up an awful lot of dissolved oxygen, which will, if the wine's left on fine lees, be digested and resolved. But if you bottle straight away, you're bottling with very high levels of dissolved oxygen, which is, again, really very undesirable. And then people bottling increasingly in the mid-90s with much lower sulfur levels than they historically did. And perhaps, I mean, I think some of the wines of the 80s and 70s were bottled with sulfur levels which were painfully high. And some of those wines today reek of sulfur, particularly from sort of lesser Negos or whatever. But you can clearly go far too far in the other direction. So you have all these processes and practices we've talked about have all gone together to create more fragile wines that are more susceptible to oxidation, wines that will, in fact, likely oxidize. And then you get into the issue of closures, which just deteriorated catastrophically. And I talked to producers who found, you know, variation in oxygen transmission rate from high quality corks, supposedly, of 1 to 80 within a batch. Obviously, you can't calibrate a sulfur level, your free sulfur level at bottling, to that kind of oxygen transmission rate because it's so variable. Half of your wines will be reduced and half of them will be oxidized because there is no, the average of one to 80 is not meaningful. The distribution is just too great. So there's no compromise that you can have in terms of sulfur unless you just over sulfur everything hugely. And then, beyond that, there are all sorts of structural issues with the corks themselves. And this is where the peroxide rinses are perhaps an issue, not so much because peroxide is an oxidizing agent. So obviously that has attracted a lot of attention and has been the lightning rod for scrutiny. But I've spoken to cork producers who said that, especially in the early batches, peroxide bleaching was very unevenly applied to the corks. So the corks are rotated in a drum in the factory, having been cut, and the peroxide is just chucked in. And corks are absorbent, and this is hydrogen peroxide is a liquid. So we're just talking about some of the corks seeing a lot more of it than others because they were where it was poured on at that moment. And as an oxidizing agent, it actually destroys the elasticity of the corks. So this is, in fact, my interest in peroxide is whether it may have resulted in some corks being less pliant, less elastic, and therefore producing a less good seal over time, rather than whether some sort of oxidizing contaminant made its way into the cellular structure of the cork to oxidize the wine. Although, there's some debate about that. It's probably also an interesting question to follow up.
Well, it would seem to kind of explain if you buy a case of wine from the domaine, and you get into them and you kind of go through them maybe in a day because the first few are oxed, but magically the fourth bottle is perfect, right?
Yeah, and I think that's just down to the variable transmission rates between corks. That said, I think we probably all opened old white Burgundies that were in good state, which had terrible, little stubby corks, and that's one of the things that convinces me that the underlying wines are also more fragile.
So is that also the quality of corks which were deteriorating because of
yeah, they're became much more variable.
So creases where the peroxide liquid could still be hiding from the washing cycle.
Well, it's not that, it's just that some corks would get more contact with the peroxide as it was applied, and that would be correspondingly have more damage done to their cellular structure and be correspondingly more brittle. Not really about the idea that there's a trace. If you leave hydrogen peroxide exposed to sunlight for a day, it breaks down. It's an unstable substance. So I don't really buy that notion that it's sort of percolating in to the corks and then being leached out into the wine. I find that less persuasive. But the idea that the way the corks were bleached could have made some more brittle than others and less good closures, I think thereby making already significant variations in oxygen transmission rate from cork to cork even worse. I think that's somewhat persuasive.
Yeah, but because when you have the liquid really go into the cork, that it will not be so susceptible to being neutralized by the.
Well, I don't. Yeah, but I think it's just that it's reacting with the cork. If you immerse wood in any kind of bleaching agent, it loses all of its structure and breaks down. I think the same thing. This is the thesis that I've heard from a cork producer who recollects what was done and how it was applied. Now, he said it was just damaging its oxidizing agent capacity, was just breaking down the lignin and the cellular structure of the corks that saw too much contact with it. But that's I think just one minor factor amongst the many that we've talked about. And you can see how some of these could combine to create a very bad result, or that a very good closure could mean that that underlying issues in a wine wouldn't become evident in the result at the end, or a use of huge amounts of sulfur in very good closures could mean you could get away with quite an oxidative élevage even, for example. So I think if you have to take all of these different aspects from start to finish, from the vineyard to the bottling, into account if you want to adequately explain the variety of different outcomes that you've seen at different producers.
Yeah, and to that point, I think, when a producer changes or upgrades their closures, some may scoff at that act, but that actually proves that they're willing to address the problem all along the line. So to me, that's a great sign.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think now I don't think there's any stigma at the stage when Lafont, Leflèvre, Bouchard, Lamy, Koffensheinen are all using DMs. I don't think there's really very much stigma. Especially, ironically, I'd say there's probably more stigma for sort of cheap entry-level wines in the French supermarket than there is for wines above $250 retail in the US, which is kind of ironic situation to be in. There are some producers who use DM30 for their top Grand Crus and use regular cork for the lower level bottlings, which is not something one would have ever imagined would be the case 10 years ago. But yeah, I mean, I've just got the Bouchard 2018 Merceau Perrier open, and this is a DM, I think DM10, they bottle everything in. I think Bouchard, or DM rather, made a mistake to call them 5, 10, and 30, because it's simply variable permeability. It doesn't really say that much about potential longevity of the wine. And there may be very reductive wines for which a 5 or a 10 are more appropriate than a 30. But I mean, I've seen people, and I've been guilty of it myself. You open it and it's a DM5 for a wine you expect to last 30 years, and you think this is not very ambitious or aspirational for this wine. And I would like, I have higher expectations for it, and it seems like the wine's being sold short. So I think DM really should come up with a better grading system for permeability that just makes it transparent. It's about oxygen transmission rate. It's not about how long the wine can last.
Right. And
even if it's a proxy for that sometimes.
I guess another good thing about DM is when you're using DM, less sulfur is needed, right?
Yeah, or at least you're just going to get much more consistency. I mean, this is something I've seen for my Chenin Blanc. I mean, for our first vintage in 2017, we used very expensive ND Tech, TCA-free corks from Amarim, and it cost about $1.40, which is quite a lot for corks. I mean, you can't spend that much more for corks unless you really, really try. And even so, when we did the subsequent vintage with DM, there's a lot more bottle variation with the 18. But it's none of the wines are oxidized, but you can tell, knowing the wine intimately, as I do, because I must have tasted it probably 100 times. You see each bottle are very slight differences, and DM definitely eliminates that. I think the other real significant difference from a consumer perspective is that, the oxygen transmission of natural cork is not linear. So you get a big burst of oxygen just after bottling, which comes from oxygen that's retained in the cell structure of the cork coming out into the wine. And that clearly sort of helps the wine get through the shock of being in suddenly this much smaller vessel with a hit of SO2, whereas DMs go dumber, I think faster. Equally, you don't have to add so much SO2, so perhaps the effect is less pronounced. But no, I do think that that immediately after bottling DM, it shows particularly reserved and restrained, and that this gets less, the differences, the divergence between the two get less significant over time. So DM has a very linear oxygen transmission rate. The other is, of course, that there are oak extractives in natural cork. You smell a great natural cork. I mean, next time you open a bottle of Koch or whatever, smell the cork. They smell wonderful. I mean, there's vanillin, there are tannins, there are all sorts of things in cork. So it's actually really, you should think about cork as a second kind of oak that the wine comes into contact with. And it can impart very positive characteristics to the wine. I think it's, so as a producer, I can understand why producers like Lamy were very hesitant to change, because they, on the one hand, are frustrated by this flagrant variation in permeability, what it does to their wines, and on the other, there's nothing quite as good as a really great quality cork that has done what it's supposed to. So it's very it's a very tricky situation as a producer to be in. I think I would personally, with the Chenin Blanc we make in California, we use DMs. I mean, the wholesale price is $120 a case. So from an economic point of view, it makes a lot of sense. Making white wine in Burgundy, I would still be tempted to go with the best quality natural corks that money can buy, and take some risks just for those bottles that have that extra dimension. It's the same in champagne. A lot of people are adopting the DM product there called the Mythic composite cork. And it's very good, but it's very homogenizing. and I think maybe if you get that bottom 50% of bottles are better, you maybe lose that top 3% of the magic bottles. I don't know. It's an interesting thing. It's
Yeah, those
it
little
comes down to priority.
microorganisms that we've come to love in our old aged wine, right?
Yeah, no, of course.
Well, I guess now we can name that group of producers who all use the same high quality cork you mentioned.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just one of the connections. So I've been trying to. I mean, I spend a lot of time thinking about this, and I think we agreed that a group of producers that have not really had significant issues with Premox, even if some of them have been episodically touched, would be Cocherie, Ravenna, Domaine d'Auvergne, and Domaine Leroy, and also Pierre-Yves Collin. And they do all get their corks from Francisco Segura, which I think is maybe suggestive, because Ravenna, for example, again, we talked about this yesterday. I talked to Bernard Ravenna quite extensively about lees. So they ferment in tank, as you may know, and then they do the élevage in predominantly used barrels, mainly from cooperage, Chassin and Mercury. And I said to him, so how much lees do you take when you rack to the barrels for the barrel maturation? Because I was curious to sort of, on paper, Ravenna and Dovisa make the wine almost identically, and why do they taste so different? This is sort of what I was getting at. I assume that they use more lees, which is why the wines are a bit more textural and a bit fatter, a bit richer, as I find them often. And he said, to paraphrase, I never understood why we change babies, but we leave wines in their own excrement. So his idea was he hates lees. He doesn't like lees contact, and he racks very clean to barrel. And yet the wines, for all that, spending time in oak, are not particularly susceptible to premature oxidation. So again, if you compare that with the contrast with Domaine d'Auvergne and Lalue, who presses hard and keeps all the bourg pretty much, and makes very reductive wines that see a lot of lees contact. I mean, they have almost nothing in common in terms of winemaking. And yet, again, they also don't seem to be particularly susceptible to Premox. In fact, I never had a Premox Domaine d'Auvergne wine. And what is the only common link I could come up with between Domaine d'Auvergne and Ravenna are the Segura corks, which of course also are used by Koch and a number of other people. So that's one cork producer who does seem to be able to deliver the goods, at least to some clients.
At least there's some commonality, right? The closure and
it's one commonality, I don't want to say that that's a silver, but because that's what I've been trying to avoid saying throughout the whole discussion. But it is interesting,
Right.
So.
Okay, I think we've covered that pretty well.
Do people have any questions? I don't know if I want to. If it's really
I think there are going to be some follow-up questions on the when everyone kind of gets their chance.
Right.
I guess next up we had the challenges in scoring Burgundy wines for you. I kind of see where you have the number, which you kind of pay homage to maybe the wine, the producer, the crew, what have you. But I really get from your tasting notes whether maybe the style, whether I'll like it or not, that kind of thing.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I would, and to sort of point, I never tire of making how challenging it is scoring wines in Burgundy in many respects. And I would suggest that, in fact, if you look at how the 100-point scoring system that critics worked in Bordeaux, it really worked as an alternative hierarchy to the existing hierarchy of the 1855 classification in the medal, right? Whereas if you look at the tendency of the 100-point system when it has come to be applied to Burgundy, it's actually to reinforce the existing appellation hierarchy. So it's the highest appellations, the most lofty crew that seem to always monopolize the highest scores. So it's interesting that a system that in Bordeaux had almost sort of disruptive, almost insurgent sort of influence, shaking up hierarchies, for better or worse, has in Burgundy tended simply to reinforce the very strong existing prejudice in favor of certain appellations. And that's something I see, in terms of how the wines are made and how the vineyards are farmed. Every step of the way, practically, even top producers are reinforcing the hierarchy rather than attempting to efface it. And I'm not saying there's no hierarchy of sites, but I think there are clear huge site differences, it's very important, and it remains one of the most fascinating things about Burgundy. But if you really sort of historicize appellations, we see that appellations are much more recent overlay onto the landscape of Burgundy than the climat. The idea that the distinct sites that produce distinctive wines is very old, but the appellations themselves much more recent, come out of a particular moment in sort of corporative politics of the French Republic. The Premier Cru, for example, were introduced during the war, as you may know, as a way when the Third Reich's demand for wines were increasing. They were threatening to requisition lower appellation wines in Burgundy, not requisition, let's say compulsory purchase, because all the wine pretty much was purchased. And so the French forced through, the first thing they did, they expanded the Grand Cru, which were exempt. So Corton was expanded hugely in early 1943. And then they came up with the idea of Premier Cru as a way to create another layer of the classification that would exempt some of their best sites from possible compulsory purchases, sort of an ordinaire for the German troops and German civilians. So really that hasn't got very much to do with terroir, or with monks, or with the lofty sort of history of Burgundy that we hear so much about. And that a lot of those sort of hierarchical distinctions have been overlaid onto a pre-existing series, set of climat and lieu-dit, which have to do with site difference. So I'm much more interested in site difference and hierarchy of site, even though I acknowledge some sites evidently are better than others. And I think we have today this sort of situation where to a rather ahistorical and almost artificial degree, we have these expectations that a certain plot touches another one should be radically superior to it. In reality, oftentimes that's to do with the lower classified plot being planted with inferior genetic material, being cropped at a higher yield, being harvested prematurely or too late, and being given a less extended maceration, shorter élevage, less new wood, So I'd say that and the critics have just become another piece of that system that tends to promote and reinforce this hierarchy of appellations that is really a legacy of the period 1919 to 1943.
And then now that you're making your own wine, how has that changed the game for you?
Well, it really makes it apparent to you some of these things. You can look at a vineyard and see, well, of course, this vineyard is unlikely to produce as good grapes and accordingly as good wine, all things being equal, as the other. And one thing I hope to do is really tether wine writing to viticulture a little better. A lot of people appreciate the Matt Kramer book because it was able to sort of say who owned plots in which lieu-dit. But to me, that sort of information is really not very interesting unless you know where it is and which exact plot it is and how it's farmed next to the others. So I have a project of doing more work on this, of making it with photographs, maybe some video, showing people how differently cultivated adjacent parcels in Burgundy can be. Because, when you walk through the vineyards, when you look at the parcels, it's not a surprise that Cautious Merceau Perrier is so much better than so many others. And it's really not a surprise to see that Claude Dugas' Griotte Chambertin is as good as it is when you compare his grapes to the Charme Chambertin of Camus, which is just down the street. So I want to do more with that. I think that's one way to fight back against just storing wines on hierarchy, to really get involved, follow the vineyards throughout the year and taste the wines regularly. But, I'd say to sort of go back to backtrack a little bit after having talked so much about hierarchy. I think while I don't taste that much. I probably taste 500 wines blind a year out of 4,500. So not a huge proportion of what I taste, but I do try to score wines as if I were tasting them blind. That's difficult to say, but I really, there's a strong tendency when you see an appellation to think, well, it's a Chambertin, so maybe it should have 92 rather than 91, even though it's not that good. And I really try to fight against that. And if there's a great wine from Rouilly, not to mark it down because it's from Rouilly. And if there's a great wine from Vergisson, not to mark it down. And it's tough. It's really very tough because spending a lot of time in Burgundy, one internalizes this. You talk to producers about it. You talk to them about their yields in their Bourgogne or whatever, and they say, oh well, it's Bourgogne quand même. Huh? All the same, they like to say, oh, I have the right to make X hectoliters, as everyone has internalized it. So it's really cool. It's ambiently cultural. This hierarchy. It's not just something that you can either be influenced by or not. It's everywhere. So that's the real challenge, I would say, to Burgundy, as distinct from other regions.
Right. Okay, shall we get into the natural wine movement?
Yeah, I mean, or we could talk a little bit more about winemaking. I mean, I guess one thing that I'd like to say about that is that.
Oh yes, there was a few
yeah, it makes you more aware of how wines evolve during élevage, and more sensitive to, if you're tasting just after somebody's racked and sulfured their wine versus not, or if you're tasting on the first cold day of winter when the temperature just dropped 5 degrees in the night in the cellar, things like that, they really change how the wine presents. So I think that's very important. I try to be very aware of that as I taste from barrel. I mean, I'm a lot younger than a lot of people doing this, so I have to have find some way to get a relative advantage, as I have much less experience. I'm only 30. Then the other thing I'd say is that it enables me to have technical discussions with producers without, hopefully without them feeling that they're liable to be misunderstood. I think of an example of a producer I know in the Côte de Nuit. She'd told a journalist that her press wine was all at 15.5 alcohol in the 2015 vintage. Now the press wine, because especially if you're working with whole clusters, you break grapes that are still full of sugar during the pressing. So the press wine always has higher sugar than the free run, and it always has higher alcohol. So this is not weird, and her finished alcohols in her wines were 13.5 in the 2015, so nothing crazy extreme. But the journalist went and printed that all of this particular producer's wines are at 15.5 in the 2015 vintage, and so people started avoiding buying them, thinking they were too high in alcohol. So hopefully hopefully I'm not going to make that kind of elementary mistake, and that at least makes people a little bit more open to discussing technical issues, which I do believe are important.
Okay. So the natural wine movement.
Yeah, no, I'm keen to distinguish that this is, I think of the natural wine movement really as being a movement to do with winemaking rather than viticulture, because there are so many producers who are natural winemakers who farm chemically. I mean, I can think of one in Burgundy who's quite famous and celebrated, who uses Roundup on her vineyards. So it's not really about natural farming. It's about a particular set, I think, of winemaking practices, principally lower sulfur and generally also carbonic maceration. And it does seem to be, there's space for a lot of different ways of making wine in Burgundy. It's a big region, and there are a lot of different communes, appellations, things you could be doing. And I would hate for there to be one monolithic way of making wine, and I certainly wouldn't want to be the one determining it either. And some of these wines being made in the sort of more natural style, absolutely delicious and have real integrity. And they are made, in some cases, with really great farming that's very sustainable. And I'm a fan. Some of the things Sylvain Pattaya is doing, we mentioned, I think are delicious, terrific wines. But I'm sometimes a little disconcerted to sort of see the growing fashionability of sort of carbonic maceration winemaking in Burgundy, and also lower sulfur levels. We talked about Premax already. I don't think anyone wants to see even more oxidation or bottle variation in the wines. And I wonder, they're just sort of thinking aloud, but it's something I've been reflecting a lot lately. So why, in other aspects of the food and wine world, why do we have artisan bread, artisanal craft brewing, artisan cheese? And why is it in wine we don't have artisanal wine, we have natural wine? I think it's the answer comes down to sort of historical accident. But why, I regret that there is not a more sort of systematic defense being made of an attitude to winemaking which has to do with, say, using practices that have been validated by 150 years experience. But because by that metric, everything we find disagreeable about farming and chemical farming is out. Filtration is out. Any kind of enzymatic extraction, enzymatic clarification, additives, centrifuging, a lot of bad things we don't like around, but we keep sulfur. We even keep, if people want inoculation of must, because Louis Pasteur was doing it. We keep traditional process of clarifying wine involving racking, allowing the wine to naturally sediment in barrel and long élevage. So I think that a very persuasive case could be made for that. And I think you could, looking at the top producers in Burgundy and elsewhere, find that as a common thread amongst the very good ones. Some of the producers in the natural wine movement, you would be able to include in any kind of formalized definition of artisanal wine. Others would be kicked out, and I think it's a pity. I mean, Slot has been saying some things about trying to, with the Union de gens de métier, about manifestos in this regard and what have you, but it hasn't really caught on. I think we need, in the wine world, some sort of equivalent of what other foodstuffs, other beverage movements have had, of an artisanal winemaking movement. It's an alternative in the culture, So because I think the alternative, what we're liable to get if we don't have that, is more carbonic maceration and less sulfur, and more of these sort of glue styles of red Burgundy, which is okay, it's fine, but I really think better and more serious things can be done with Richebourg and Merceau-Perrier than natural wine per se.
All right, great. And the last kind of formal item we had was the most underrated villages, producers, climats. Any come to mind here?
I would just say as an interesting rule to people should look at producers who are doing pioneering things viticulturally, who are really serious about their vineyards. And that often will guide you towards really good people, irrespective of where you are, And I kind of try to shy away from giving the denomination value to some of these producers. Like, whenever I write about Vincent de Roy's wines from Ruy, I try to avoid saying that they're values. They are great value because they're inexpensive relative to a lot of other wines that you could buy. But that's not the point. They are great wines in their own terms. So it's a tricky thing. I think sometimes that being called a value producer can be a bit of an albatross, especially if you want to do viticulture that is expensive, and it might mean that you have relatively high prices for your appellation, because de Roy-Chantillard's wines are some of the more expensive, and Ruy probably the most expensive. So yeah, look, de Roy-Chantillard would be very high on my list of people who are interesting. Thomas Boulet, Jean-Marc Amery, Vincent, and at the other end of the spectrum, it's hardly valued because they're incredibly expensive. But for incredible Premier Cru, Grand Cru, Beaune, and other Côte de Nuit appellations, someone like Charles Lechaux, who's really pushing the boundaries viticulturally. Even those wines are absolutely very far from given away, as I know, to the detriment of my bank balance when I buy them. But if you really want the best effort that's possible in a given site, that's what interests me. So I have much less interest in buying by the hierarchy of appellations. I would rather somebody's absolute best effort, irrespective of where it comes from. And right. I think between Jean-Marc Vincent's Ancêtre d'Arès and Charles Lechaux's Romanée Saint-Vivant, there's a huge chasm in price, but in terms of the effort and seriousness, there's a lot more in common. So Jean-Marc Vincent is one of the first to talk about raising the height of the canopy, rolling, doing a lot of the viticultural techniques we already talked about, but he was doing it in Santenay and not in Beaune. So, I think for decades, he found it even hard to get journalists to come and visit him, let alone be anointed the next star of Burgundy, which if you're in Beaune Romanée, that happens after 2-3 years, So I try to support, for my personal cellar, I support producers who I think have really serious viticulture from start to finish, and then good winemaking. It's pretty basic, but it's harder than you might think to find the ones who tick all the boxes.
Yeah, we kind of talked about, Chassagne versus Pouligny, at least from collectors that I talked to in the States. There doesn't seem to really be the same level of respect for Chassagne.
And Pouligny is just, as I said yesterday, it's just far too easy to sell Pouligny.
Right.
Because everybody's heard of it. And people have heard of Morrichet as well. It's these, I think of these sort of the Idée Feast of certain villages being the sort of top villages to go for it, just have no bearing on reality. You know, we're talking about a classification formalized in the 1930s, which kind of froze consumer preferences of that period, that continues to be applied today, and it's ultimately it's unhelpful. I mean, one wouldn't abolish it because it's part of the culture of the region at this stage, and it is what it is. But yeah, the idea that it is weird that there's a prejudice, relatively speaking, in favor of Bouligny in the market when there are so many more good producers in Chassagne-Montrachet. I mean, that's clear. I don't think even